Hey sis.
Who, me? Who, me? Who, me?
Yes, you. Hello, welcome to the Hey Sis, Yes You podcast. I am your host, Jaleesa, and today I have a beautiful guest, one of my favorite people on the interwebs. Everybody say hi to my amiga, Rosdaly. Woo! I really need to get a little sound machine in the background. How are you today, sis?
I'm good. I am good. Mom life. It be trying to take you out, but
Yeah, girl, I
I'm
know.
still here.
You're still here and you look good. Would you introduce yourself to the podcast?
Yeah, I'm Rosdaly Ramirez. I am a mom of three. I am a wife. I am a New Yorker, so I'm a city girl. Specifically a Bronx girl, right? Because I was born and raised in the Bronx.
Don't be fooled by the rocks that she got. She's still Rosie from the block. Hey.
Listen. Right now, the Bronx has a beef with J-Lo. We're like, sis, you can't be
Oh.
repping us. You can't be repping us and not
Oh.
coming back and not coming back
Wow.
to help.
Okay. I'm here for it.
But yeah, I'm a stay-at-home mom now. I used to be a school social worker. I'm still pursuing social work in different ways,
Yes, you
but
are.
this is where I am.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. Okay, so you know that I'm just big on storytelling. And before I get into any of my thoughts and questions, I really want you to just share some of your story with us because it's important to me that people see the woman before they see what she does or all of her subcategories, mother, wife, content creator, entrepreneur, all of those things. And there's so much depth to you. So I'm super excited to get into those things, especially because I'm someone who's just always so inspired by you. I mean, I think I started following you and you just had one baby on Instagram. And now you're a mom of three, you have your master's, so many great things. But first, I would love for you to share some of your story with us.
Yeah. So let's recap. Let's recap. Man, I guess right, my story starts very like I was raised by an immigrant mom. My mom came from here from Honduras, so I'm half from Honduras and half Dominican. My dad is Dominican. She came to New York very like ambitious, like she met my dad, and then when I was 9, they split. My mom has a lot of, like a lot of struggles, a lot of trauma. And so I think a lot of my upbringing really rooted in how I transitioned into being a teenager and also being an adult. And I think in the last few years, yeah, I think in the last few years, I've just kind of been unpacking, right? A lot of that. Like, what does it mean to be an immigrant daughter? What does it mean to be a daughter of divorced parents? What does it mean to be the daughter that feels like the black sheep in the family?
Hmm.
I think one of the biggest things is, no one in my family is a Christian. And so when I became 20 years old, when I turned 20 years old, I actually got saved. And interesting enough, right, this during that season, it was my second time leaving home. I had a lot of struggles at home, and so I was very much a runner. So every time there was like beef, whether I started or not, I'm like, I'm out of here. Like I'm not trying to be here. Like you guys are, it's just a lot.
Yeah.
And so literally in my second time of leaving home, I was working at a Christian job as a tutor. And I remember when I got the job, I was like, listen, I'm not a Christian. My friend told me about this job. I just need a job. I like kids.
I'm
So
here
if
for
you
the
could just give me
money,
this,
okay?
I'm just here, because I need a job. And praise God, right? Like the coordinator saw something and she's like, yeah, like I definitely want to hire you. And I worked there for about 3 years. And I would see the kids, because we had to like do like worship songs, we had to read them stories from the Bible. And I'm just here like outside living my life. I'm like, whatever these Christian people are doing, I don't want to partake in it. I'm good.
Hmm.
Um, and Lord and behold, right? Like eventually I had to leave home again. And my boss, he had like an apartment for the missionaries that would come to the program. And he's like, "Yeah, I have a room for you." He's like, "You want to live there?" And I'm like, "Yeah," but I'm like, "You don't pay me enough, so like I can't really give you much." He's like, "No worries, no worries." He's like, "I'll leave it to you for like $300." I'm like, $300 a month? No worries. I go to live there and I live with two other roommates and they're also Christian. And again, living my life. And the Lord really meets me there, right?
Mm.
He allows one of my roommates to really speak life into me, introduce me into a church. And while at the same time, right, I ended up meeting my husband there, but as a
Aw.
friend. Yeah, my husband actually grew up in that program because that program
Aw.
served a lot of inner city kids.
Wow.
And so my husband, the director there kind of just took him under his wing as a father figure. And so him and his mom worked there, his sister worked there,
Aw.
and we were friends there. And so from that, right, I started going to that church that my roommate had introduced me to. And my husband was also going to that church at the same time. And from then, right, like I eventually transitioned a couple of months after into saying like I wanted to be a Christian. I got baptized. And eventually I went back home. I really felt like the Lord led me back home to restore a lot of things that I had broken out of just being rebellious, right? And although I think it's rebellious, but I think also acknowledging, right? Like the condition of my home would did never felt safe.
Yeah.
And so it made it easy for me to just consistently leave.
Hmm.
And if I wasn't leaving home, I was spending as much time away from home
Mm.
because it didn't feel like a safe place for me. And so, yeah, I became a Christian. I went back home. The Lord called me to go back home. And from then, I was part of this church and I became more friends with my husband. And then I started dating my husband there. Listen, I think a lot of, I used to hear a lot of people talk about how like marriage sanctifies you. Is it sanctifies you?
Yeah, for sure.
And I never understood that. One, because obviously I didn't come from like an upbringing where people had healthy marriages, right? Like
Right.
I can count the women in my family that had healthy marriages.
Yeah.
And in my immediate, right, like the immediate people that were helping raise me, none of them did. Right? I
Mm.
got married and then my two other aunts got married that same year, right? Like
Wow. Yeah.
and so yeah, I think there was a lot of things that God was really doing in my life and just unpacking a lot of wounds. I think
Mm.
sometimes we think, right, like, oh, you become a Christian and you're a new life, a new creation, and we say all these things that are true about us. But ultimately, right, like what we aren't going to erase is the fact that you come with baggage, right? Like you
Right.
come with trauma. And there are things about you that God is trying to heal. And I think sometimes we stubbornly want to hold on to those wounds as a safety net. They make
Absolutely.
us who we are, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't want to change that much. Like I'm like,
Right.
I don't want you to touch that wound or open that door.
Mm.
And I think for like, man, like I feel like for almost like 8 years, like that was very much my story. Not allowing God to kind of heal a lot of heavy parts about me. And so I was just transitioning into new roles and causing a lot
Yeah.
of chaos because of those unhealed wounds. And so now, right, I'm 33. I've entered my Jesus year,
Your
super
Jesus year.
excited. And I think, right, like in a way, you tend to, I feel like people talk a lot about like number 33, especially if you're a Christian, right? Like, and when we
Yeah.
think about Jesus, Jesus did so many things at 33. And I think I've always been like a very reflective person. And I also think that therapy revealed a lot of that, which is why I think a lot of my content it tends to shift on like a storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Just me kind of telling you what I'm thinking. It's also my way of being able to process what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and
Mm.
saying it out loud instead of keeping it to myself,
Right.
which I feel like that's an area that I had to grow a lot, right? Like it takes a lot of boldness to feel like all your life you were kind of like a shadow and kind of like you don't speak, you don't get to speak, whatever you
Yeah.
say, no one cares about it.
Right.
And kind of putting yourself right in a position of like, I need to be able to hear what I'm saying, right? And if I'm saying it out loud, my hope is that someone is hearing it, right? And they would resonate with it.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I can't be the only one. Like
Right.
I'm like, if I'm thinking this, somebody is, are you thinking this? Like, I just want to
Right.
know. And so, yeah, that's where I've been. And it's been such a, just like a beautiful and hard and really a story of like, man, trying to understand who God is. You know,
Mm.
when you aren't raised a Christian, right, you have different ideas of who God is. And then I think I became a Christian and I also had an idea of what a Christian should be. And so it
Yeah.
was good for me. I understood playing the role of a Christian, what you shouldn't do and what you do. But I think when it came to knowing God, I'm not sure I fully knew God, right?
Yeah.
Until he was like unpacking, right? Like a lot of things about me. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing. I have so many questions. I was thinking about when you said you were talking about trauma and how sometimes it's hard for us to let that go. What point in your story, like you grew up, your parents divorced, your mother was an immigrant. I remember you sharing that on TikTok one time and people in the comments just being like, hella rude, and like I stepped into your comments and was trying to fight people. Um and so I'm sure that came with some identity things because your mom was new to this country and then she was raising you, and then her and your dad divorced, and then you grew up, and so you had all these traumas with you. At what point in your story did you begin to start to work through that, detaching your identity from your trauma? And I think not even like, oh, we rid ourselves of this trauma, right? Because we do carry it with us. It is a part of our story. But at what point in your story were you no longer like wearing your trauma as a badge of honor, but more so working through it so that you can be healed and your trauma is now just a part of your story, but it is not the whole sum of who you are?
Yeah. I think I want to say like I can date it back to like 10 years ago. I know that right before I got married, I started re-going to therapy. I was so I was struggling with like anxiety, and my anxiety was kind of displaying itself at picking my hair. And so for a few years, I picked at my hair so much so like I was having like I had like bald spots,
Mm,
because my anxiety was like internal. So it wasn't necessarily displaying itself externally. I think externally it was just that I was picking at it, but I wasn't necessarily saying that I was like under extreme trauma. And a lot
yeah.
of that, kind of exposed itself in college, right? In college, I started having like a lot of memories of my childhood. And for a long time, I just didn't really have memories, right? Like, I
Mm,
think I think praise God, right? Like in a way, like there's just some things like God keeps us from remembering.
yeah.
And so I feel like a lot of my childhood, I just don't. I think after my mom left my dad, I have more memories, but before that, I really don't have memories. And so when I was in college, I was a psychology major, and I think that triggered
Yeah.
a lot of things in my brain. And so I started unpacking like a lot of sexual trauma, um, that I had to endure, right? I endured as a kid, but then also unpacking it in a way of like, what do you believe about sex? What has been
Mm,
told about sex to you? What have people done, right? That it has been sexual to you that ultimately, right? Like, it's not the picture that God designed, right?
yeah.
For intimacy to look that way. And
Mm,
then I also started unpacking a lot of things, right, from my parents and my mom and dad's relationship, and really understanding, right, like who she is and what she experienced and why she is the way that she is.
Right.
And so I think during that time when I was in therapy, it wasn't so much about, okay, like you're here because you're picking at your hair. We're going to focus on the hair part, but we really got to talk about what is happening, right? Like, what is that
Right.
trigger? And so I think, man, for like 8 years, I was in and out of therapy. And in those 8 years, right, like I left home again, right? I got married and marriage was hard. And then I had a kid and it was also hard. And while at the same time I was doing all those things, God was really revealing, like, hey, right? Like you keep you keep opening like these doors and you don't want me to touch them. And
Mm.
so at this point is I'm gonna let you open them or I'm just gonna open all of them. We'll figure it out. And I think
Yeah.
I remember telling my husband in this process where I'm like, man, like I always thought that God was like a gentleman, right? Like he's not gonna come into my room without asking. Like, how dare him? And my husband was like, Dolly, you really think that that's how God works? Like, he said, let me tell you something. If there are things in your heart that God wants to expose for the purpose of healing you, he gonna ask you about the key for the door, right? Like he's gonna
Right.
open.
Yeah.
And so what it felt like, literally I had this vision in my head. It felt like I was in a dark hallway. And in this dark hallway, there was like 20 doors. And literally when he turned on the light, it felt like he opened all of them. And
Wow.
everything that was in those rooms kept like it just flew out of them. Like it flew out of them. It's like, when you have like everything like piled up in the closet and then you open it and
Yeah.
you're like,
Yeah.
I
Like
thought I
I'm
was
picturing
that.
like all these bats just like rushing out of like this cave or something.
Everything flew out.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably like the climax, right, of my story with God, right? Like
Mm.
really being like, man, like if I don't expose these things, you're really not gonna grow. If I don't
Mm.
expose things, your marriage will not work, right? If I
Right.
don't expose these things, there is a chance, right, like that you're going to cause a lot of damage in your
Wow.
motherhood journey. And because
Mm.
of that, right, like I'm not gonna give you a choice. And man, like, yeah, like those were painful years, but I learned so many things, right? Because one, right, like I very much took on like my trauma as a badge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was my identity, like woe is me,
Right.
all of these
Yeah.
bad things happened to me. Like I grew up being very told like, oh, like, like we always, like you have a sad story, like life was so hard for you. Like that is the story that my family always paints for me to this day, right?
Mm.
And so I think I took on that identity of like, oh, woe is me, right? There
Wow.
is no hope, right? There is no happy ending. And even though there was good things happening in my life, I was sabotaging all of them,
Wow.
right? It was in my
Yeah.
nature to say I am undeserving of good things.
Mm.
I am undeserving of a new start. Like this good thing is happening, but I know it's gonna end, so I might as well just end it. I'm gonna do
Mm.
everything possible to ruin it because I'm not worthy of it, right? Like this is my
Wow.
identity. Woe
Yeah.
is me.
Yeah.
And so I think God, right, was very much revealing this identity that wasn't of him, right? Like,
Mm.
when we come to know him and we understand our role as a daughter, right? Like we realize that there are identities that we took on that they weren't
Yeah.
given
Yep.
to us by him.
Yep.
And I think, yeah, I think that was very painful because, when you make a mark for yourself of something,
Yeah.
you live out of that. The
Yeah.
way you love people, the way that you build friendships, the way that you love your kids, the way that you love your
Yep.
husband, right? Like those are things that it's like, well, this is all I am.
Right.
So now what?
Yeah.
And I mean, they were very painful, but I think, praise God, right? Like that I get to see God as a healer. I think for a long time, I kind of looked at him like, oh, like, other people abandoned me, and actually you did too, right?
Mm,
Like, I mean, like,
absolutely.
where were you, right? Like,
Right.
where were you when all of
Like
these
you could
things?
have kept me from
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I'm like, where were you all those years? Like, if you were
Right.
so good and you were so real, like, so why didn't you? I'm sure you've done that, right? And if there's anything that I've had to learn, like, I think being honest with God was the most like real and impactful thing that I could have done for my relationship with him, right?
Mm,
Like, I needed to be honest to say, actually, no, like, I don't actually think you're a good guy. I think
wow.
that you pick and choose who you
Mm,
say. I think that why is it that some people have a story that sounds better than mine, right? Like,
yeah.
where were you, right? Like, when I experienced all this trauma. And I think the more that I wrestled and the more that I was honest with him, I think the more that he revealed himself to me,
Wow.
right? And then I'm like, oh, like, you meet me there, right? Like, I'm
Right.
thankful, like, you're meeting me in my honesty, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think so many of us, right, especially when we're hurt.
Sorry, girl. My allergies are on 10.
Yeah, I think, so many of us, especially when we try to communicate with people that have hurt us, we
Yeah.
often feel like there's going to be pushback. And I think God very much was allowing me to say what I needed to say
Mm,
and meet me there, right? It wasn't
right.
about giving pushback. It wasn't about, it was, I'm going to let you say what you need to say.
Yeah.
And then the rest of it is, right, like, God, what I have to say about God, what I'm saying to God does not change who God is, right? Like, God is faithful, God is
Yeah.
good, God loves me. Like, we know that He is healer and He's redeemer of all things. And so I think oftentimes, and right in those conversations, I'm like, I'm pretty sure God is like, I'm unfazed by whatever you're saying. Like, I hear you, but it
Yeah.
don't change me, right? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make me fear, right? Like, it didn't make me fear my relationship with him, because I don't think he was coming into these conversations as like this dad, like, I need to make sure you think I'm still good. It's like, I already know I'm good, right?
Right.
Like,
He's not
but
insecure,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
he
he's
can
not
handle
insecure,
it. He
but
can handle your questions. He can handle your frustrations because he's not insecure. So I
not
get
at
it. Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah.
Mm.
But
That's so good. Honestly, like listening to that, all I can think about is how brave you are because I think that like it is hard to experience trauma, but for some reason it's like comfortable to stay
mhm,
with those habits or with that identity. And what I'm hearing you say is that there came a point in your life where you no longer were like I'm no longer identifiable by my trauma. Like I want to be identified as healed. Because if you are identified by your trauma, then you are parenting out of trauma. You are being in a relationship out of trauma. You are serving God out of trauma. And ultimately, is because this is who you think you are, right? You are this traumatized individual. And so, one, that's really brave. So, I just want to say, first and foremost, I'm so proud of you because that's big, you know? I have a question. So I think about in the scriptures, right? We know that like when Jesus called like a demon out, he had to cast it somewhere. It didn't just like get called out and like float around. And I really believe that it's the same with our trauma. When we like open up that door, like you're talking about, all these doors open and all these things started rushing out. If we don't send them somewhere, right? If they're not placed somewhere, they can come back. We can like invite them back in. And so where did that go? Like when you were like exposing yourself or God was exposing you, all of these things were being exposed to you. Where did you place that? Like, how did you assign that outside of you? Does that make sense? Like, I have all
mm,
these traumas, like you mentioned sexual trauma, you have trauma from your childhood, all of these things. How did, when those doors were open and those things started to be revealed, what happened next?
yeah. Well, with any trauma that is exposed and you are someone that identifies with your trauma, it almost felt like, yeah, I think, it kind of bleed into, right? Like my biggest relationship, which was my marriage.
Yeah.
Um, and for 5 years it did that, right? Like as
Mm.
God was uprooting more things, and the more I was like trying to like figure out like, okay, like you're doing a lot, right? You're trying to change a lot, you're trying to heal a lot. And then instead of it being lashing out at God, I was very much lashing out at my husband. Um, and those years were really hard, right? Because it was a place of I'm not intending to hurt you,
Right.
but I feel like I'm under attack. And the only person around me that I feel safe enough is you.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people tend to, I think sometimes we tend to shy away from talking about how trauma impacts those that love us.
Right.
Because when you experience trauma, you know that, right? Like for a fact, like
Yeah.
that person's trauma impacted me. But when you're the one that is traumatizing, right? Like it is causing trauma on somebody else because of your
Right.
own trauma, it's very hard for you to kind of say out loud, like, I'm
Mm.
actually bleeding on somebody else and I'm
Mm.
causing hurt, right? And unfortunately, right, I think two things were happening, right? One, I was growing, right? And God was healing and he was revealing a lot of things. But then
Right.
at the same time, right, like a lot of chaos was happening in my marriage, right? A lot
Mm.
of insecurities were being built, a lot of wounds were being um done, a lot of other things were getting exposed, right? About me that again, right, like I told you, right, like I very had this nature of like I need to run, right?
Right.
Like I don't feel safe. I'm gonna sabotage this because I know this is a good thing, but now that God is revealing all these things, surely this person will leave.
Yeah.
And before they leave, I need to like get out.
Right.
And that was very much like the first 3 years. I was very much like, actually, I don't think I shouldn't have gotten married. Like, I don't think I should
Mm.
have gotten married. I think I need to be by myself. I probably should go back home. And, those were very hard conversations, right? Because it's not like I was talking to a random person.
Yeah.
I was saying, right, these things to my husband.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm thankful, right? Like, my husband, man, like, he met me in such a way that I think that if there's anyone that could display like God's love for me, it was truly my husband.
Oh, I love
Um,
that.
and I think that although, right, like I would tell anyone, like honestly, I think it is best for you to take time to know yourself and heal
Yeah.
a lot of things. You're never fully gonna be healed, right? Because we
Right.
know that we're gonna be a new creation, a new body when we're in heaven.
Right.
But God, right, is doing work here too.
Absolutely.
And yeah, obviously, I would recommend anyone to just start that journey before you get married. It just so happens that I think God allowed it to just happen while I got married.
Yeah.
And I think God, right, like just really allowed Ruben to kind of take on this role. That was painful, right? Like I'm not gonna diminish, right, like the fact that my husband got hurt. Nobody wants to hear someone say like, I don't want to be married, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody wants to say like I have all this sexual trauma and like I don't want to be touched, right? Like I don't
Yeah.
want to do anything. Um,
Yeah.
because you build insecurity in somebody else.
Right.
And even from the start, right? My husband came into our marriage and even our relationship really with his heart on his sleeve. And
Mm.
I came with the breastplate and the armor, like I'm good. Like, I'm good. Like, good for you, bro. But like, I'm just gonna put this plate of armor on it.
Yeah.
And praise God, right? Like that we are in a new season where my trauma isn't my identity, right? Like
Mm.
where I can say, like, man, I'm Rosdaly. And like God is healing me and He is going to heal me one day. But I can live in the freedom of being healed, right?
Mm.
I can live out the goodness of being someone's wife. I
Yeah.
can experience, right, like intimacy in a
Yeah.
way that is fun, that is safe,
Oh, I love
uh,
that.
that is vulnerable. I can be a good mom, right? Like
Mm.
I don't have to be afraid that I'm gonna mess up my kid because of my own trauma.
Yeah.
I can, you know, right? Like I can enjoy motherhood because of that new identity. And yeah, I think trauma has a really interesting way of being exposed, but if you don't know where to place it, it will be placed on people that really don't deserve it, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
they're they want to love on you, but your trauma can wound a lot of people.
Right.
And I think it was really my job to kind of take on the responsibility to say, okay, well, you're either going to stay with this identity or you're going to move past it,
Yeah.
right? God has already exposed it.
Yeah.
Let God clean it up. He's
Yeah.
gonna pick it up. Stop
Right.
trying to pick up stuff, right? Because that's the thing, right? Like when we think about the closet, like I'm like, the stuff is coming out, but in a way, you're still gonna find yourself trying to put stuff in the closet. Just
Yeah.
like sweep it back in, close the door. Sweep it back in, close the door. And as you're sweeping them back in, you're continuing to take on more baggage.
Mm.
And God was very, right, like very specific of I opened them, stop trying to pick them up,
Right.
right? I
Yeah.
opened them, stop trying to collect what makes you feel right safe.
Yeah.
Stop trying to collect what makes you feel like, well, this is all I am and this is who I'm gonna be for the rest of my life. So I
Yeah.
need these things because this is who I am.
Yeah.
And I think he was very right, like on top of this Dolly. Like, what's inside the bag? No, no, give it back. I don't want you to pick up nothing. Like,
Yeah.
I want you to give me the whole bag.
Yeah.
Stop trying to pick up stuff because
Mm.
they make you feel safe, because they, you know, they identify who you think you are. Like, I exposed them and now you got to give them up,
Yeah.
right? It's almost like, right, like those hidden skeletons in your room.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm like, it's easy to unpack, right? Like the sins that are like, you know, like is obvious. But the ones that we don't really want to share, the
Man,
ones that we
those
kind of
hidden
hide,
ones. Yeah.
like, right? Like those are all things that, in fact, I think that the ones that we hide the most are the ones that really keep us, right, from being known fully by God.
Yeah.
Because it's like God can know I'm bitter,
Right.
but like God don't know, but like you know, like this other thing I won't share with God, right? Like even though He knows all things, but we can. I think it's easy for us to say like, God, like help me be more generous with my money, like help me be a good friend, help me not be bitter, and it's like God, like there are some things in my heart that I know are not of you,
Yeah.
and like they're hard, and I don't want to give them up. So help me, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah,
Yeah.
been something.
Oh, that's so good. I'm like, okay, I want to get into your content, but first I want to ask you, so you have this beautiful story of like healing and journeying to healing. Like it didn't just happen overnight. It was a process and a lot of things happened in the process, but you are no longer like identifying yourself by your trauma. Like you said, I am Rose Dolly. So I want to hear three things that you now identify as that are completely outside of your trauma. But what are three things that you believe that God has spoken over you, or you tell yourself that, like, no, I'm not that anymore. I'm now this.
Yeah. Three things. First, right, like I am, and I'm worthy of love,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm not this hard person to love. Like I'm an easy person to love. I'm lovable.
Yeah.
Um, I think that one is like the first one.
Mm.
I think the other one is, right, like I am free to be myself, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not someone that really like I don't kind of hide myself. I kind of show myself how I am. And you're like, either you take it or leave it. Like, this is
Yeah.
just how I am. My
Yeah.
humor, right? How I love
Oh,
people, what I
I
like,
love that. Yeah.
right? Like how I dress, all those things. Like, I've always been very okay with saying, like, well, this is who I am.
Hmm.
But I think before I was very insecure because I grew up very much being told, like, no, like, that's not good. Like, you can't do that. You can't wear that. You
Yeah.
can't say that. You can't do this.
Mm.
And I think now, right, I'm living in the freedom of like, actually, like I can do whatever I want, right? Like I
Yes.
can dress
Period.
how I want, like there's all those things, right? Like honor God. I'm free to do it.
Yeah.
If I want to dance, go dance. Like just
Period.
go
Yes.
there. And so, yeah, kind of living in that. And then also, right, like I think for a long time, like I I used to say, right, like I wasn't like a physical touch person. And again, right, I used to attach my trauma to that.
Mm.
Yeah, I used to attach my trauma to not being a physical touch person and not wanting hugs and not wanting to be embraced and just not, that's not it. And right in this new season, right, it's really been like, Lord, like, how could we say that we are not like physical beings? Like
Yeah.
when you created us to be in community. And I mean, I married someone that his love language for his physical touch, like one, two, three, four, five. But right, like even in the friendships, right, that he's given me, right, like with women that love to embrace me, that want to physically affirm me. He gave me my first son that, my gosh, the kid, he is like all physical touch. Like
Aw.
if you know, if you knew me from before, and my best friend says this a lot, she's like, man, like it's crazy that God would give you a son that just wants to love you, like wants to
Yeah.
hug you, like he always wants to hold your hand. He wants to be affirmed by physical touch, like everything.
Yeah.
And she's like, to the one person that is like, ah, like I'm afraid of like just don't touch me. Like
Right, right, right.
and and literally, right, like God's grace in that, right? Like that God would place, right, like specific people in my life to help me identify as a new person, right?
Mm.
Like healed me, right? Now it's like
Yeah.
I love hugs.
Mm.
Like I love hugs. I feel so safe, right?
Mm.
Like I think for such a long time I felt like yeah, like I was so undeserving
Yeah.
of of being embraced or feeling like right like my sexual trauma robbed me of experiencing touch in a way that makes you feel loved, right? And that was my biggest wrestle. Like, how do I embrace something that you created to be safe and
Mm.
beautiful when I feel so unsafe? And I
Yeah.
feel like anyone's touch feels like a knife, right, is going to be
Yeah.
on your back.
Yeah.
And man, I remember in therapy, like when I was doing like therapy with my husband, I remember he had once asked the therapist and he said, he's like, how come, I see her, right? Like with our son and she's just different, right? Like, why does she allow him to embrace her? Like, why does it feel like it's different? And And with me, it's like a cross. Like I don't want it. And then, I remember the therapist telling him, she said, she feels safe around him, right?
Mm.
Like she feels safe by his embrace. With children, right? Like children don't really judge you. Like they kind of take you as
Right,
you are,
right,
right?
right.
Like they are kids, right? Like can sense, right? Like some kind of
Yeah,
something is off in an adult. But for the most part, right? Like they meet you with so much innocence and
yeah,
embrace, right? Like they
yeah,
think you're cool. They affirm you like randomly about your hair or your clothes. Like there's so much that kids, like their innocence is so detached from reality, right? Like
right.
reality is that people do have bad intentions. Reality is
Yeah,
that people come with sin. And so, for him, my husband hearing that, he's like, "Oh, well, I guess I didn't see it that way." Right?
yeah,
Like, and I was, right? Like my son, right, played another role in kind of shaking up the rest of what I was trying to
yeah,
keep in the bag. Where
yeah,
it's like, girl, like this is someone else that loves you,
right.
right? Like,
Mm.
oh, like this person loves me, there's no string attached, right? Like
Yeah,
even if I'm a good or bad mom, like he's still like trying to find me, right? Like
yeah.
even though I'm like, hey, actually I don't even know if I want to be a mom. Like I'm
Mm.
just trying to figure it out, right? And so, right, being physically embraced, right? Like allowing myself to know like I am deserving of
Yeah,
physical embrace. I'm deserving of community, right?
yeah,
Like, and yeah, I think those have been really hard things, right, to kind
mm.
of grasp
Yeah,
because they do trigger,
mm.
and some triggers can feel like overwhelming.
Yeah,
Uh, and then sometimes, right, like they can feel really freeing. And so I
yeah,
think I'm in the part of like I feel more freedom than being
mm.
triggered. And even when I am triggered, I know that I can come back, right, to
Oh, it's
reality, right?
beautiful.
Like um so yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So, like, you're worthy of love, you're free, you're safe. And I think that we, your followers, right, the people, like I always say, in your cloud of witnesses, we get to experience that. And it translates to your content so well. Like, I tell you this every time I talk to you, but I'm so inspired by you. I'm inspired by the way that you show up. And hearing your story, it makes a lot of things make sense for me because I'm like, and I asked you this before, like, you're so vulnerable on social media. And there's this new wave, right, of like authenticity, but it's a trend and it feels fake because it's a trend. Whereas,
Mm,
like, your content has always just been so authentic, so vulnerable. I mean, you'll get on there and you'll be like, I'm broke and this is why it's hard. Or like you just set the camera up and you'll just share. And it's so encouraging because I'm like, oh, like I can relate to that. Or like, oh, I thought like you're an incredible influencer, you're a really dope content creator. And so to hear somebody like you with like all these followers and all these brand deals just get online and just be like, I'm struggling right now. Like I got food poisoning and I look rough, but I got something to say. And oh my gosh, it just gives me life. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So you started this
mm,
series. You started it right before your 33rd birthday, and it is like my favorite thing ever. Um, it was you talking about like I'm about to be 33. This is my Jesus year. And Jesus was doing a lot of really dope things. And we're supposed to, I guess, allegedly, by 33, we should have arrived to something. But, and I remember in your first video, I was cracking up because you were like, here I am. I have hella debt. Why did I even get that master's degree? And I'm just going to, leading up to my birthday, I'm going to share all of these moments where I'm nowhere where I thought I would be. But
mhm,
I'm also acknowledging that that is okay because God withholds no good thing. And I remember when you said that, I paused and I really sat with that. Like, ooh, okay. If I know God and I believe his word is true, I do believe that he withholds no good thing from me. but I also feel like I'm very far from where I thought I would be. And I also feel like I've put in a lot of work to be much further than where I am. And so I really loved your series because it was very vulnerable. I mean, I think you were so intentional that even the way you recorded it felt vulnerable. You know, you could see your whole body. You could see how you were like sitting. You can read your body language. You can feel what you were feeling. And so, one, I want to know like what in this influencing world that could be very like show up as your best self, put your best foot forward at all times, be beautiful, be confident, be 100% sure of yourself. I want to know, like, where did you find the courage, because it is courageous, to show up and be like, actually, I'm just going to be me and you're going to learn something because I have a lot to share. And then also, just like, what is some encouragement you would give women, especially there's so many young girls, particularly, that see social media as like the goal. Like they want to have all the followers and they want to have all the presents. But I can really appreciate someone like you who's like, I do have a lot of followers and I get really good brand deals, but I'm like never gonna pretend. Like I'm not gonna put on a facade. Where does that come from in you? Like that confidence and that vulnerability? And then also like so many of us are not where we thought we would be. Oh my gosh. I thought when I turned 30, girl, I would have arrived. I was going to have abs, a big fat bank account, a big fat booty, and like I just have it all together. Okay. I turned 30, my heaviest weight ever, all over
Oh,
the place with what I was doing with my life, just like a disaster. It felt like a disaster. And so your series has been so encouraging to me on many levels. But first, I want to talk about where does that like boldness and that courage to be so vulnerable online come from?
yeah. Yeah. I I think for a while, right, as I've shared like the other part of my story and where I've been the last few years, I think it was gradually happening, right? Last
Mm.
year, through IG, I used to be known as like Transparent City Mama.
Transparent City Mama, yeah.
Oh, and so I kind of took on that name because again, I I was showing another level of vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? And that was the vulnerability of like trauma, right? Like carrying the identity of my trauma.
Mm.
And so Transparent City Mama kind of took us on the journey of like what it means to be a mom, right? But a
Yeah.
mom that is like, I don't got it together. Like, in fact, I became a mom and I was like, honestly, I don't even want to be a mom. Like,
Wow.
I don't know how to handle this. This is a lot for me. Like, I'm afraid that I'm gonna like traumatize my kid. I'm afraid that I'm gonna be exactly like my mom was. I just don't want to do it. And I think God allowed me to build that platform with being relatable through my trauma, right? Like
Mm.
through sharing, like, this is really hard, right? Like sharing my experience as a NICU mom, as a first time mom, as a mom that has heavy, right? Like generational trauma. And even intergenerational trauma, right? Because when we think about generational trauma, we have to think about it as a whole. But
Right.
intergenerational trauma is the one within, right? Like
Mm.
the one that you got from your mom, the things that you get from your dad, like.
Yeah.
And so I think he allowed me to build that platform, right, from that, and it was a good
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
Because I think I needed other mothers to say, "Girl, like you're not alone." Like
What just happened?
it's like fireworks. What's going on with Apple?
Wait, if you're watching this on YouTube and not on audio, her whole like Zoom screen just had a party.
At a party. So yeah, like I think he allowed me to like build that platform because I needed other moms to see me, right? Like I
Yeah,
needed other people to remind me like you're not on this journey by yourself, right? Like
yeah,
motherhood is not the curated Instagram like pages and pictures that we see. It is much more than that. And
absolutely.
so last year, right, I came to a point where I said, actually, I no longer want to identify as that name.
Mm,
because I was kind of taking on the role of like, I'm not identifying as my trauma anymore,
mm,
right? And I think two things were happening. I started to grieve that maybe people couldn't relate to me anymore because now I was in a new season, right? Like I was in a
wow,
much more
yeah,
healed season. And so
right,
whatever version that they got of me when I started this platform, they might not connect to it anymore
right,
because
yeah.
that's not the one that I'm following with.
Mm-hmm.
And then the new version, right, when I changed my name to I am Rosdaly Ramirez, I think it kind of stamped the reality that I was more than just a mom. But
Mm,
now I was presenting myself as myself, right? Like
yeah,
all of it. The wife me, the insecure me, the mom me, the stay-at-home mom me, like all of those roles I wanted to display in different ways.
yeah,
Uh, with vulnerability, but then also with hope,
yeah,
right? Like because I think that needed to happen, right? And I think God was really calling me out of names that I had given myself into an identity that He had given me before, right?
mm,
It's just now I was actually living in that
yeah,
name. And so I think this year, right? Like I think a lot of the content has changed because I've shared more things about myself, right? Whether it's more
yeah,
thoughts that I've had about my marriage, about being a stay-at-home mom, reflections on what it means to be a mom and a working mom. Sharing more things that I love, right? Like putting more stuff about outfits that I would
yeah,
wear. Like
right,
those are all things that
right.
I kind of shied away from doing because I didn't feel confident. I didn't
Mm,
feel like I can present myself as myself.
yeah,
I felt like I needed to present myself as one specific version on IG that was only about the mom.
yeah,
And I think, right, I think oftentimes we do a disservice in just kind of identifying ourselves through our motherhood journey because there's a lot more layers of us, right?
absolutely.
And so I wanted to present myself as all of me, right? Like me as a wife, me as myself, me as
Yeah,
the mom and what I like. And so in the new series, right, that I did before my birthday, I was kind of reflecting like, "Hey, Lord, like it's been hard. Like the last year and a half, like we've struggled financially. I've been a stay-at-home mom. We haven't been able to get work. I had to like get help from like government assistance. Like so many things were happening.
yeah,
And I'm just like, Jesus, like what is happening?
mm,
Because like, like I got my master's. I was working at the time. I had gotten a raise. And then you go and say, actually, I need you to transition home
mm,
again, right? Like, and I think again, right, God has been leading, right, things up in a way that it's like, oof.
yeah.
Now that you're in a like in a healed version, I just want to let you know, well, let's see how we can walk through that,
Yeah,
right?
mm,
And yeah, I remember, right, like when I really felt led, like he asked me to like leave my job. I'm like, first of all, I just spent 3 years doing this master's. So what you gonna do with that?
right, right,
Not only that, I was at my job for like 6 years and they barely gave me a raise. And the
right.
last year that I have to leave, they give me a raise. Like, they gave me double of what I was making.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm like, Lord, like you know I've been like praying for this and you know that I've been working really hard. And right now you're about to ask me to just step away from it.
Wow.
And I transitioned home because also I had another baby and my husband, he was doing really well with like his heart stuff. And he was also a director for like a youth program. And he was like, honestly, he's like, I think we're doing well enough that like I'm gonna actually leave the other job. And yeah, for a while he did great. And then things crashed, right? Like I
Yeah.
think the economy has been going well, but also when it comes to our industry and freelance work is a hit or miss. Everyone wants to be an
Yeah.
entrepreneur
Oh
until you
gosh.
realize
It's so hard.
it's till you realize it's so hard. Till you realize people don't pay you when you finish
Yeah.
work.
Like you
They
have
pay
to
you
chase
30.
money. It doesn't just come to you on the 1st and the 15th. Like, no, you have to chase the money down, okay?
And so everybody wants to be there. And then we were stuck there. And so we went, we lived off of our savings. God was still providing, like, He would provide like brand deals. I did it. I ended up doing like a commercial with like Dove. And so even through that, like I got paid, but then I would continue to get,
Yeah,
paid because they were running the commercial live. And so, so many things. Like I feel like in every brand deal, every check that we got, I kept saying like, and he provided, and he provided, and he
mm,
provided.
yeah,
And like living out of your savings and also seeing your savings kind of disappear, you're like, what? Like so you're gonna come up, right? Like you're gonna
Yep.
come and like give me something. And literally he was coming up, but he's like, sis, you gotta pay the rent. No worries, I got you, but it's for the rent.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
see you in 2 weeks, so you got to pay the next thing. And I would be like,
yeah,
oh, okay. And so
yeah,
I think that when you think about your 30s, right, especially as a woman, is interesting. People would look at me and think, but like you kind of made it, right? Like in your 30s, like you had your kids already, you're married, you technically had a career, you got your master's, like you're like set. Because everyone puts the pressure on like women, like, when you getting married?
have them
When you gonna have
babies,
kids?
get that man.
What,
Yep.
how much money? And it's like, girl, like, why are we
Yeah,
putting so much pressure on women to have and achieve certain things at a certain age?
yeah,
And I think as I was having those conversations with God, I'm like, Lord, like, I really feel like this is something that a lot of women need to hear,
yeah,
right? Like, I think a lot of women also in my life were echoing the same thing, right? Like, echoing, like, I'm still not married, or I still haven't gotten to move out. I don't have enough money. I'm struggling in this area with heartbreak. I'm
mm,
struggling to have a job and then be a mom. Like I don't even know how to balance both. Like how do I achieve all these things
yeah,
when it's like I guess I thought I would be elsewhere. And right,
mm,
and I think when it comes to you thinking about where you thought you would be, I think oftentimes we only think about the negative, the things that we haven't gotten, the things that we haven't achieved,
yeah, for sure.
right? But on the other side of that conversation is, man, like there are some things that you are experiencing right now that you thought you never have,
Yeah.
right? Like that you thought you would never experience. I like if someone would have told me at 33 you would have 3 kids and you would stay at home, be a stay-at-home mom, I'm like, what? Give me another story. Give me
Right,
another
right,
story. Like, that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of work.
right. All
And
boys too? Ooh,
all boys too.
yeah, I know.
And man, like I think God was right. Like really, as I was reflecting on these things, I'm like, yo, like I have to reflect on where I'm not and where I am.
Yeah.
And I have to leave room for the grief of this is what I don't have. And I
Mm.
thought I was gonna have it, right? And this is where I actually am. To the joy of like, wow, like I have really good blessings, right? Like
Yeah. That's
really
special.
good things that like never in my life, I never thought I would be a stay-at-home mom,
Mm.
right? Like even though I'm a stay-at-home mom that's struggling, like it's
You still
okay,
with your
right?
babies,
Like, yeah, like
right?
I never thought that my marriage would be in such a healthy place,
Oh,
right? And yet it is, right? Like
beautiful.
I never thought that there were so many things that we were like struggling before as a family that now it's like we're unfazed, right, by those
Wow.
things because they're not well what brings us more joy, right? Like we
Yeah.
don't value them as much as we did before. And then also acknowledging, right, like it's okay for me to tell God, like, God, like I thought that I would have more money. I thought
Yeah.
that actually after I got my master's, I would be a full-on social worker and I'll be a
Yeah.
therapist. And I thought even with my platform, right? Like I thought it would grow more and I thought I would be able to make this a full-time job and I
Yeah.
can't, right?
Yeah.
And so there's so many things that I think I needed to leave room while also allowing myself to be in a position, right? In the video that was vulnerable, right?
Mm.
Like I wanted to show all of me, right? Like for people
Yeah.
to see like my hesitation, right? Like my fears.
Mm.
If I'm starting to cry for my face to show like it was changing, right? Like
Mm.
because there is something beautiful about being vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? Like and people actually seeing you because now it's like I'm not afraid to show anymore like who I am.
Mm.
Like, right? Like those that are gonna love me are gonna love me and that's great, right?
Mm.
But like what I'm not trying to do is kind of hide, right? Like who God, like what God has been working on all these
Mm.
years,
That's so
right?
good.
Like God
Yeah.
has been transforming me and healing me. And I think he's now, right, has called me to kind of be like, man, like you're living in a new identity, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I want you to show that in a way that is like, man, like I have arrived. When I think
Yeah.
about the words, right? Like, and even the scripture where it talks about like going from glory to
To
glory.
glory. Yeah.
And I think about that and I'm like, man, like that's my journey. My
Mm.
journey of God rescuing me and taking me from one level to another. And although, right, we think oftentimes we may think like, oh, but in each level I should get better, right? Like
Right.
my
Right.
situation should get better. Like I
Yeah.
should have more
Yeah.
money. I should have all these
Yeah.
things. And it's like, well, not really,
Mm.
right? Like as I've right, as I've gone from glory to glory, I've experienced more of his goodness, right? I
Right.
have seen him in different ways. I have
Mm.
experienced his love, right? In ways that even if I'm in a different level, and it might not look the way that I thought, right? I've experienced God in a much different way.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I've been, right? And
Mm.
so I think I think more women, right, like need to be able to know, right, especially on social media, like life isn't what we share it to be.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, right, like we have to be honest. We know that social media is a platform for people to share what they want to
What they
share
want. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
in entertainment, in I don't know, in like reflections and silliness and good things and horrible things, right? Like you're gonna share whatever, but we have to understand that all of it comes from one specific lens, right? We're not ever going to fully give a full picture of what it
Mm-hmm.
is, right?
Yeah.
Like the mom that like kind of puts her camera, right, like on one side where it's like cleaned up. But if
Yeah.
I flip the
Yeah.
camera,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
like
It's a hot mess.
there's a hot ass mess. And guess
Yeah.
what? We come into social media thinking that that's not true,
Yeah.
that what you just showed me on your that little corner that is like tidy up, that your
Yeah.
kids are doing a craft is all that your life is.
Yeah.
And we do a disservice to ourselves coming into social media believing that. And the
Mm.
only reason we believe that is one, because we are insecure of where we are, right? And so
Yeah.
any other grass is much more greener than
Yeah.
yours.
Yeah.
Not realizing like maybe that grass was bought at Home Depot,
Yeah.
right? Like
Installed
maybe you
today.
didn't listen. Sometimes I'm like, you know that you gotta plant seeds, right? Like, and you
Yeah.
gotta water that
Yeah.
ground in order for grass to grow.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can also buy your grass. You can go buy it. It comes in squares. You
Yes.
plant it in your backyard and it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
But you know what doesn't look beautiful often? The one that you planted. When you
Yeah.
put those seeds, when you've been
Yeah.
when you have to mow the lawn, when you have to plant, when you have to
Do
like
the
put water,
work.
when you
Yeah.
every work, nobody wants that grass. We
Yeah.
want the nicer grass, or we assume, oh, like those people did the work, like
Yeah.
their grass is so good, and I'm like,
Mhm.
sis, they probably bought it. Like
Yeah.
they bought it. You think
Yeah.
it's so green, but they really just bought it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think. I think really like, right, we have to be able to come on in social medias in a place of like, I have to be secure in where I am,
Yeah,
right? Like what I'm seeing is not the whole picture.
right,
And unfortunately, I think that's why, right? Like mental health is at its highest. And not even, right? Like, I mean, the pandemic, I think, played a huge role in that. But again, right, we continue to see this facade of perfection, of life is so good.
yeah,
Even when we hear the statistics, right? Like the statistics of how much credit card debt is in the collective
right,
of the United States. I'm
yeah,
like, but y'all out here buying cars, but we out here
yeah,
like doing everything. But then the United States is like, yo, we broke. Like people owe us credit card debt. They owe us tickets. They owe us. People can't. They have no housing. Right? There's more people in shelters. Like the inflation is wild. Like more people are getting food stamps because they can't afford
right,
like food in itself.
right,
But guess what? Those are not things that we see.
yeah,
And sometimes, honestly, right? Like there is wisdom and not fully sharing, right? You also want to have wisdom with what you share,
right. Like
but
filter
what you
it.
don't, yeah, but you also
Yeah,
don't want to almost right, like filter yourself,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah, I think
Like,
it's so beautiful how you have found that balance. And I think that one thing I really appreciate about your content is that you're very vulnerable and also honorable because I think like for me, like I want to be vulnerable, but I also want to honor people who are a part of my story that it's maybe not mine to share like the
mhm.
full picture because it would be a dishonor to them. And so I you share so much about your situation, your trauma, your experiences without ever dishonoring other people who are a part of your story. And I think that's really beautiful, but also like I just really want to thank you because being like a millennial influencer, like being a millennial, being in this like social media space and even harder for the generations after us because that's all they know. It has been such an interesting journey for myself to like find this balance of like curating content versus like actually just living my life. And I remember coming to this point where I was like, I can't be an influencer because I'm not good at curating. And I didn't think that I thought you could only do one or the other. You have to be like a really good curator or you just like have to get off social media. But then I come across like you, and I'm like, actually, this woman is in this space, a content creator, but she's not curating a life that looks good on display. She's actually me, like, and I am her, and she's you and you and you. You did posts about like how to get like SNAP benefits if you're in need of like food assistance. You've done posts on like you talked about living in the nuance of like grief and gratitude, and you shared so beautifully how you can have both. And you talk about like mental health for mothers, like 5 ways to tend to your mental health or ways that you can like seek help. And it is just so inspiring. And so I want to just thank you. And I know you have thousands of followers, and I know that there's thousands of people in the world just like me who are truly benefiting from your obedience. Like your whole story as I'm listening to you is one of obedience. And I think like I've been reading in First Samuel, and I'm at this part where Saul is not being fully obedient to God, but he says, "But I did this." He's like, "Oh, I heard you, but I did this instead." And Samuel says to Saul, "Obedience is better than sacrifice." Like God wants you to obey him. He wants you to walk in obedience. He doesn't want you to just be like, "Oh, I did all these wonderful things." And I think that your story is one of obedience. And so many of us are benefiting from your obedience because when my husband and I took this financial hit, I would have never thought that there's like all these people on social media who could understand because
Yeah.
you have all the followers and all the brand deals and all the, and then I'm talking to people like you or some of my other friends who are big influencers and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so broke," or "Oh my gosh, I'm really struggling financially." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, me too." Like, I'm not failing, That is so important. And so it's just, as you're
Yeah.
sharing, I just want to tell you, like, hey, sis, like, you are truly changing the game for so many of us on social media. And I want to give you all the flowers that you deserve, because to be that vulnerable is incredibly scary. And you are just so courageous. And there's so many, like, I'm constantly sending your profile to people because I'm like, people are always like, want to be influencers or want to have all this followers. And so they're buying stuff just to return it, buying stuff just so they can create content so that their house looks a certain way or their wardrobe looks a certain way, like fake it until you make it. But then you have somebody like Rosdaly who shows up and is like, I'm not faking nothing, but I'm still pursuing my dreams. I'm still pursuing the goal. And oh, that is powerful. And we need more of you. We need more of you.
Thank
And
you.
so thank you so much for just your presence. And you said earlier, you were talking about like healing during marriage, like, and you said it obviously would be better to do that before. But then you also said that you, through your husband loving you through that journey, you saw the love of God. And all I could think about was like, okay, so God placed you in your marriage before he allowed you to heal so you could experience his love. And then you went on to talk about like getting your master's degree and sharing all of these things about motherhood on Instagram and like having this niche, but then feeling like you were starting to like emerge out of that and not sure how that would translate to your followers. But they, you called it glory to glory, and it was so beautiful for me to hear that, because you didn't say, oh, I've already made all this money, I've already bought this beautiful house, I've already lived all of my dreams, and so I've experienced glory to glory. No, you said, I'm struggling and striving, but I'm also joyful and thriving, and that is glory to glory. And I want the world to hear that. I mean, I wish the whole world could hear that message. Glory to glory. I am getting emotional, but because I think that as a woman, we feel so pressured to have become, like, I've already become, but you're telling us like glory is actually the shaping, glory is
Mhm.
actually the process, glory to glory is actually the metamorphosis, it's actually going
Yeah.
from one step of understanding to the next step of understanding. Glory is actually, there's breath in your lungs today, sis. And that means that he's not done with your story yet. And that is so
Mm.
powerful and so beautiful. And so I just want to just
Thank you.
tell you thank you for all of the ways that you are teaching me and showing me. And I know I'm not the only one. So
Thank you.
thank you. No, thank
No,
you.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you.
Um,
I am so grateful and privileged and honored that you would be here. And I would love for you if you can just share one nugget with women who will hear this and who will um, feel like, gosh, yeah, I can relate. I'm not at all where I thought I would be. What is one thing that you would tell them to really, I guess my question has changed now after listening to you. What is one piece of advice you would give women to see every part of their story as a piece of glory?
yeah. Um, I think, right, like I think is being able to walk, right, like
Mm,
in authority for who we are, right, like
yeah,
in Jesus.
yeah,
And I mean, if you're not, right, like a Christian, right, like the hope is that you would know, right, like that you would ground yourself in an identity that is outside of the one that the world gave you or even you gave
right,
yourself.
right,
But I think when we talk about, right, walking in our identity in Christ, when I'm walking in that identity, I walk as my full self, right? Like I can come into rooms knowing I'm already loved. I
right,
can already say that although I don't have something, God has already declared it over, right? Like,
right, right.
even though my other sis, right, it seems like God got her, it's like, well, God
Yeah,
already got whatever he got from me, right? Like, I don't have to worry about anything because God has already, like, it's already stamped for me, right? Like,
yeah,
I like to think like God has, right, in our journey, he's already placed specific things that are for us. And
yeah,
although there's other people walking the road with us, like it doesn't have their name on it.
yeah,
And so I don't have to be afraid, that I'm missing out because I don't have
Right.
something now. I don't have to be afraid that so and so is in another place in their journey and I'm still
Mm.
10 steps behind. Because the
Yeah.
truth is, right? Like whatever God has for me is for me.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think, yeah, and I think we have to walk in that truth.
Mm.
It'll release us from the anxiety of wanting to pretend to be something, having things that we shouldn't have, rushing into relationships that God is not calling us into, like
Mm.
because of the namesake of missing out.
Yeah.
And it's like you're not missing anything. Like
Right.
God has you like where He wants you to be.
Yeah.
And you really have to like embrace that, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you for that. I'm taking notes and I want to practice that more. So thank you, Rosalie. Thank you so much for being here. I am so
Thank you for
grateful.
having me.
Oh, the honor is mine. I love you so much, and I'm just so grateful that social media brought you to me. And I'm
Yeah.
excited for anybody who listens to this podcast to hear your story of obedience, of assurance, and that glory to glory is just so powerful. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.